Okay. No Christmas song or something? No Christmas song or something tonight? Sure. It's okay with me. Okay. So we're going to get started in a little bit. Kim's going to get a song for us. And while we're getting ready for that, let's just pray. Thank you, Father, for tonight. And we just pray that your spirit will be here and kind of rushing in here tonight, Father. But I just pray you'll be here and especially give us insight and wisdom and ears to hear what you have for us to learn from this amazing book. We ask this in Christ's name. Amen. Hi, smiley guy. So we're going to start tonight in the book of Ecclesiastes. And I was telling Zonnie last night that this has been a very rewarding for me to study this. I've read this book in the past, and like, oh, this is kind of a crazy, depressing book. But we could spend 12 weeks on this book, and we're just going to do 3 weeks. So I'm going to try to kind of just be an introduction to it. And so you have a study guide and questions. Hopefully you had a chance to read through it and answer those questions. But we're going to do a little different format for the next couple of weeks. Instead of going through the questions, I'm hoping the questions will prepare you for discussion and conversation. And so it'll take oh, go ahead, and we're ready.
Sorry, I don't know if this is in or not. It's not mentioning him, but she'll do it anyway. Sorry, I did not mean to interrupt you.
That's okay. I need a good song. Are you getting ready to start?
Yeah, are you ready?
Yeah.
Okay. Just audio.
What? Where's the other boys?
With Papa.
Is that Lauren Daigle? His word. Three hours. Come on, y'all can sing. Fall on your knees. Oh, hear the angel's voice. Oh, night divine. Oh, night when Christ was born. He's like, that's coming out of you? No. Oh, night divine. Oh, night. Thank you.
Just take the whole box.
When Christ was born, Amen. It's just incredible to think about that. The invisible God became visible. And you could see him and touch him and kiss his little face. But it's just incredible. So we're studying Ecclesiastes, and I'm going to take just a little step back tonight to help understand the book and understand the writing of the book. And so we're the classic, Western civilization linear thinkers. So we think and talk point A to point B and point B to point C and point C to D, and we tell a story or we make a point that way. And that is not how the Greeks, and definitely not how the Hebrews wrote. And we see that a lot in this book. And so in this book, we're going to see similar themes kind of discussed and then left, and then come back later and discussed and left and discussed. And it's kind of creating a mosaic of thought around some image or some thought, and then a little bit more depth and a little bit more depth. And so along the way, we want to think about and identify those things, because the author is going to come back to them over and over again. And so tonight, as we think about them, I want to write them down as kind of categories or key, themes, and then we'll see as we go through the chapters how he comes back to those things. Helping us look at it that way, then we can step back further and say, why is he talking about these themes? What are the issues that he's bringing up? Because the Bible, this is a book, it's a very unusual book in the Bible. God's not really in the book. It's an author, a man, talking about his experience. Does that mean? But we don't see God speaking to anyone, God doing anything. And so why is it in here? And this is, remember, we've studied Solomon. He's a unique person. And so we want to understand that to help us. And I think as we read through it and think about the categories and think about those questions, and hopefully your study questions are helping you to kind of think about what's being read there and the challenges and the questions that the author is writing about. I think and I hope that you'll find, as I have as I studied it, how relevant this book is for us today, in our life and in our time. I think it's quite significant. Okay, the second thing is who wrote the book, and this is a very interesting. When I'm looking at this, the very first at the top of my Bible, on the top of the first verse, it says Solomon's personal experience. And so, who was the author? And in my Bible here, it says the author was Solomon, and I'm going to tell you the author was not Solomon. And I'll tell you why. You don't have to agree with me, but we'll see in just a second who wrote this. So if we look at the very first verse, chapter 1, verse 1, it says, the words of the teacher, son of David, king of Jerusalem. So that is Solomon. So the words that we're going to read, I would propose, are coming from Solomon, but I think we'll find that this is that Solomon didn't read this. If you look at verse 12, and I'll just read it, it says, I, the teacher, was king over Israel in Jerusalem. Well, was is past tense. And he was the king until he died. So when did he write this? After he died. And then if we look at, go to chapter 12, verse 9, and we're just doing this very quickly. But chapter 12, verse 9, is the conclusion. And it says, now, not only was the teacher wise, but also he imparted knowledge to the people. He pondered and searched. So the writer seems to be somebody other than Solomon, who was with him and observing him and hearing him, or even recording the things that he did or said during his life. But Solomon was not the writer of this book, most likely. And there's lots of other theologians, people who have studied this. I was reading a commentary I read about this book, and there was a lot of theory about who wrote this. But for us, I think that this reflects Solomon, and I would think towards the end of his life, this is someone who may have been a son, or may have been somebody close to him, who is writing it as if the teacher Solomon wrote. There's a lot of quotations, there's a lot of direct things that he said and did. But the reason I'm highlighting that is I want us contextually remember that this has to mean first what the author intended the reader to understand. And so I think this was written probably at the end of Solomon's life or after he died, but it reflected him at the latter stages of his life. Does that make sense? Why is that significant? Because, we talked about he's 21 years old, something like that. God gives him knowledge and wisdom that he asked for, and then he said, you're going to be wealthy and fame, and we've talked about all that. Then he built and did these magnificent buildings, and then what happened in the next 20 years? And so we highlighted last week just a few things that started to kind of but Solomon, or nevertheless, and he had lots of wives, and he worshipped other gods, and he did all these. And so we asked the question, why did Solomon do that? Because here's a guy who knew God. God spoke to him, or he saw him twice. He had knowledge and understanding. He had the Torah. What he did was intentional in his decision to have other wives. And we're going to find in this book that Solomon's going to express some of that. He's going to express why he did what he did. And so we're going to start, we'll read through this, but I want us to think about, as we read the book of Ecclesiastes, what was Solomon searching for? Because over and over in this book, he is searching. He's searching for an answer or answers along the way. And we want to record these things as we go through here. Okay, so we're going to start in verse 1, and it says, the words of the teacher, son of David, king of Jerusalem. Meaningless. Some of your translations may say vain. Says the teacher, utterly meaningless. Everything is meaningless. So we're going to stop right there and talk about that word, meaningless. It's a very difficult word. It's almost exclusively used in this book, and it has a very specific connotation with it. So if you have a chance to look it up, do a word study, read about it, you're going to find that the word is hard to translate, but what it represents, and the best way for me to communicate that to you is return on investment. It means that everything that Solomon did in his life, and we're going to see that he observed a lot of other people doing things in his life, and he watched them. And what he discovered was that all that work, or all the things, or all his wisdom, or all his knowledge, all these things didn't return anything to him. I didn't gain anything. So all my work didn't account for anything. It didn't bring me anything. There was no benefit from that. And that's what this word vanity or meaningless, the translation is trying to translate into all the things that we do in life and all the things that Solomon has done. And we'll go through these. He's going to highlight it all. They didn't return something for him. Does that make sense? So I'm just going to... do you know what return? Everybody knows what return on investment means, right? So if I have $1 and I loan it to somebody and they give me $1.05 back, I got a 5% return on my investment. So the work, I get something back for that. Does that make sense? And this concept of no return on investment. So I want us to think about that, because as we think about it, what kind of return is he looking for? That's a really important, right? If everything is meaningless, if his whole life as we see through this, so the first 12 verses of this is kind of a summary in a poetic form, and then he's going to go through and talk about that. This is a really important concept, and he is wrestling with this issue. So we'll start with that. Everything, kind of a downer to start with, right? Everything is meaningless. Nothing has any benefit. What does man gain from all his labor which he toils under the sun? So it's the same thing. There's no return, no gain, no benefit. Generations come and generations go, but the earth remains forever. The sun rises and the sun sets and hurries back to where it rises. The wind blows to the south and turns to the north. Round and around it goes, ever returning on its course. All streams flow into the sea, yet the sea is never full. To the place the streams come from, there they return again. All things are wearisome. More than one can say, the eye never has enough of seeing, nor the ear is full of hearing. What has been will be again. What has been done will be done again. There is nothing new under the sun. Is there anything of which one can say, look, there is something new? It is here already long ago. It has been here before our time. There is no remembrance of men of old, and even those who are yet to come will not be remembered by those who follow. Excuse me. Okay, he asks a question, and we need to identify these questions along the way. But one of the questions is, in verse 3, what does man gain from all his labor which he toils under the sun? So this is this issue of gaining with the value, the benefit. And then from verse 4, let's say through the verse 10, what does that represent? And we'll just pick one verse. In verse 6 says, the wind blows to the south and turns to the north. Round and around it goes. What's he describing here? Hey? Okay, yeah. Why is he, what's significant about that?
Matter, I think.
That what doesn't matter?
That, a whole bunch of these things. That streams flow into the sea, but the sea's never full. Even though that happens, doesn't matter because the sea's never full.
Okay, so he's talking about, let's think, the temporal world. The sun rises, the sun sets. The rain, it goes back to the sea, and the seasons come, and it's just, we're going to see this, there's a time for everything. There's this issue of and we'll just call it, I'll just put the world. So one of the issues is the world, and when we think about what do I gain, or he's frustrated that there's no gain for a man's toil. He's working all day long in verse 3. What does he gain from all his labor? What does he gain in terms of what? And then he goes on to talk about everything is, it's around and around. A pattern, right? A pattern in the world that seems to be set, and nothing he can do can influence that. Nothing that Solomon's going to find in his life. So he's going to ask this question over and over again. I'm going to try this. I'm going to try that. I'm going to do this. I looked at that. And over again, it's meaningless. And so meaningless in what way? And I'm going to say, here's in what way it's in the world. That's one. And then let's look at verse 11. There is no remembrance of men of old, and even those who are yet to come will not be remembered by those who follow. What's that about? There is no remembrance for men of old, even those who are yet to come. Who are men of old?
Your ancestors.
Okay, so we'll put another theme. Death. Death and dead. There's no remembrance of people who have died. We're going to see this over and over again. He's going to talk about the fact that I, Solomon, had all this wisdom. I did all this work. I built all these things. I had all these. And despite all those things that I did, it had no influence in the world, and it didn't change my outcome. And so this is a theme that he's going to talk about. We're going to look for that over and over again. And we want to identify this because it's a problem for him. This is a big issue for Solomon. At the end of his life, everything he's done and experienced, this is kind of where he ends up. A couple of things I just want to point out in verse 8, part B, it says, the eye never has enough of seeing, nor the ear its fill of hearing. And we're going to see this also. It's a theme of kind of the insatiable nature of mankind. Like, I am 65 years old, and, I've been around for 65 years, Pat a little bit more than me. Honestly, I could live another 1,000 years and not see enough. I could live another 1,000 years and not hear enough. There's so many things to learn and to do and to see. And here's a man who's the wisest person, the most, and he never had enough. And God has created us. We'll see a verse that He's put eternity in our hearts. This ability to think that I can think of 1,000 years. You can think of 1,000 years, and think of all the things I could do if I lived 1,000 years. I could be a teacher, and I could have a career as this, and I could be an astronaut. And I could, just think of all the things. I could learn to play the violin, and yet my time is limited, and my ability to influence the outcome. So one of the things we also want to look for in Solomon, as he writes, is his emotional state, because there's a lot of emotion in this book. And so we kind of see some of this. It's all wearisome. It's all whatever. Okay, in verse 12. I, the teacher, was king over Israel and Jerusalem. I devoted myself to study and explore by wisdom all that is done under the sun, or under the heavens. So here I wrote myself a question when I read this. Why? Why did he devote himself to explore by wisdom all that was done under the sun? Was it that he was just curious? He wanted to see, notice the world, what was going on around him? There was part of that. Remember, the Queen of Sheba comes and she's asking him all these questions, and other kings, and he's able to explain, trees and plants and all this stuff. So he was learning a lot of that. But now he's at the end of his life, and he's telling us, I did all that, and then in the next part of the verse, what a heavy burden God has laid on men. So after studying with wisdom and understanding, his conclusion of noticing everything under the sun is a burden, that life is a burden. It's a heavy burden, and where does that burden come from? So another part that we want to look at is this issue of God, and who and what is God in Solomon's mind by the time, at the end of his life. Because he's going to reference God over and over again, and he's going to, my board's not quite big enough, but on the one hand, we're going to read a lot of, I'll call it negative, depressive, meaningless, no return on investment concepts. So we read the very first verse, everything is, nothing in life, everything is meaningless. Everything is no return on investment, no ability to influence any of these things, right? Everything. Well, that's a pretty comprehensive word, everything. But we're also going to see that he's going to kind of, every once in a while, he breaks out of that and he talks about something, and I'll just put the word in here. So we want to look for this word called better. Not called, it is the word he uses. Every once in a while, he's going to talk about, light is better than dark. Wisdom is better than folly. So if everything is this, then why do we see that? And it's so, I'm not gonna, I just want us to watch for these things, because as we step back and we kind of create this board here, then we're like, what's going on with this person, and what's the point, and what's the message? What's behind that? What's driving these things? I think they're relevant for us. Okay, what a heavy burden God has laid on men. I have seen all the things that are under the sun, done under the sun. All of them are meaningless, a chasing after the wind. Chasing after the wind, that's kind of like I spend all my energy trying to capture the wind, but I can't capture the wind, right? And that's a very good kind of metaphor for what he's trying to say there. And then again, what is twisted cannot be straightened. What is lacking cannot be counted. Okay, what is that? That's here. What is twisted can't be mended. What is lacking cannot be counted. So he's this frustration in his ability to influence or control the world. And I just, mankind cannot fix what's twisted. It can't straighten what's twisted, cannot make up for what's lacking. But God can. So that's just a little note to have there. I thought to myself, look, I have grown and increased in wisdom more than anyone who has ruled over Jerusalem before me. I have experienced much of wisdom and knowledge. Then I applied myself to the understanding of wisdom. So I'm a wise, I have all this. I want to understand what good is wisdom, in other words. And also of madness and folly. But I learned this, too. It is chasing after the wind. So trying to understand the value and benefit of wisdom. How does wisdom help me? How is wisdom better than madness or craziness or folly? Now remember, this is the guy who wrote Proverbs, and we went through that. It sounds very different. All that's chasing after the wind. I can be the wisest person or the most stupid person in the world, and it's not going to do whatever this is thing he's looking for. I thought to myself, look, I saw this. Where am I? Oh, for with much wisdom comes much sorrow, and more knowledge, the more grief. So what's his emotional state? He's drunk. He's what?
He's drunk.
He's drunk. Here's a guy who, just remember who he is, the most powerful, the richest, the most famous, most, a brainiac, and his conclusion of all that wisdom and all that experience is it causes him grief.
I think he's also implying that, hey, if God gave me all this wisdom, and I have studied wisdom as well as knowledge, and I can't figure it out, oh, yeah, the rest of you are even worse off than I am.
There might be a little bit of that. We're gonna look. He has some references to that as well. In chapter 2, I thought in my heart, come now, I will test you with pleasure to find out what is good. So, why did Solomon take all these wives? I'm not saying this is the only answer, but there's a sense here, and we'll read through this, that part of what he did was to test. He wanted to test or explore what in his life is good. And he's defining good as getting an ROI. And how do I know that? Because he's going to define over and over again that it's not good because it doesn't do this. So I'm going to go and test with my knowledge and experience and all my wealth. I'm going to go out and test wisdom and all these pleasure and all these things to find out which of any of those is going to give me a return, my ability to influence the world around me, to have control, to change, to influence the fact that I'm going to die and I'm looking forward. That's what I have to look forward to. Okay, so I will test with pleasure. So first, one of the things he's going to test is the value of pleasure to find out what is good. But that also proved to be meaningless. Laughter, I said, is foolish. And what does pleasure accomplish? I tried cheering myself with wine and embracing folly, my mind still guiding me with wisdom. I wanted to see what was worthwhile for men to do under heaven during the few days of their lives. So that's a really important verse. What was he trying to do? So no return. He's trying to find out what is worth, what has any worth? What can I do? What can I do actionably that is going to provide worth? And defining worth, as we said, is this ability, as we see, to kind of influence the world around him. I wanted to see what was worthwhile for men to do under heaven during the few days of their lives. I undertook great projects. Yeah, he did. I built houses for myself and planted vineyards. I made gardens and parks and planted all kinds of fruit trees for them. I made reservoirs of water growth for flourishing trees. I bought male and female slaves and had other slaves who were born in my house. I also owned more herds and flocks than anyone in Jerusalem before me. I amassed silver and gold for myself and the treasure of kings and provinces. I acquired men and women singers and a harem as well, the delights of the heart of men. I became greater by far than anyone in Jerusalem before me. In all this, my wisdom stayed with me. So the sense that he was doing all this and he still had an understanding and the ability to kind of assess what was it doing for him? Was it valuable? Was it helping him? Was he gaining anything from it? In all this, my wisdom stayed with me. And then I denied myself nothing my eyes desired. I refused my heart no pleasure. My heart took delight in all my work, and this was the reward for all my labor. Yet, when I surveyed all that my hands had done and what I had toiled to achieve, everything was meaningless. Nothing had any return. Nothing had any worth. It was a chasing after the wind. Nothing was gained under the sun. So thoughts about that section, verses 1 through 11.
He talk about all about himself, how he tried to give everything, gain everything, enjoy everything.
Yeah,
It's an I thing, it's hedonism.
So here's a man who had no limitations, right? He had money and wealth and fame. He could try anything his heart desired. Anything. He could have 700 wives, and he could build cities and palaces, and he could grow and eat anything, and he could have as many people and slaves. I think it's an interesting verse. He just, in verse 8, kind of B, it says, I acquired men, women, and a harem, and as well, the delights of the hearts of men. So a human being, mankind, these, I'll say it as a question, are not these the kind of things that we desire? The things that we look for, and the lust of the eyes, the lust of the flesh. You know, I can watch TV or watch a movie or talk to people or read a newspaper. We're all chasing after something that we think is going to make us happy or is going to answer. There's an old movie, you may have seen it, Billy Crystal. I can't remember the name of it was. He and his buddies were a weekend, and they went to a ranch, like to be a dude ranch. You remember that? And there was this old guy, and he said he was always asked, "What's the one thing? What's the one thing?" And he was, waiting for the movie for this guy to tell him the one thing for like the meaning of life. In this book, you kind of get a sense. Here's Solomon, and he's going to spend a lot of his time and resources, and he's going to ask the question: everything that my heart desires, I can get, and I can try it, and I can see if it's pleasurable, and I can enjoy those pleasures. But at the end, what did he discover?
He was no exception to the rule.
No, he's no exception. It didn't satisfy what he was longing for. It didn't provide any benefit to him. Having 700 wives and 300 concubines did not provide any benefit. It wasn't worth anything for him. At the end, it didn't provide any return for him. Now, I would say if you asked 100 people out there today and walking down the street, hey, you just won $10 million. If I gave you $10 million today, would that be something that you would desire, and would it be good for you? And they would, 99 or 100 would say, yeah, hey, give me the $10 million. That'd be a good thing for me. I can do a lot with that. Well, what's it going to do for you? Is it going to provide you with security? You can have a better house, better car, more, whatever. Solomon had all that and more, and he discovered that for him, it didn't provide any value, any benefit. And he also, remember that Solomon is us. He's describing the heart of man, mankind. I refused my heart no pleasure. It's kind of almost, you get a sense of like debauchery. Anything I can think of, wine, whatever, I'm going to try it. And yet when I surveyed and I stepped back, and after how many years of that, after 1,000 wives or concubine, it was meaningless. I gained nothing under the sun. I gained nothing from this world perspective, nothing. Okay, next test. So we're going to, what things did he test? So So he tested pleasure.
Work.
Yeah, we're going to see that one along. So let's look at the next one. I turn my thoughts to consider wisdom. He's going to test wisdom. And also madness and folly. What more can the king's successor do than what has already been done? I saw that wisdom is better than folly, and just as light is better than darkness. So this is the first one. So wisdom is greater than folly. Is it folly with an E? I don't think so. And light is better than darkness. Okay, so he kind of like, wait, time out. So when I tested wisdom, did he discover that, oh, wisdom actually provides a value? It's better than that, so is there a return? Is there a gaining? And if there is, okay, what did he gain? I saw that wisdom is better than folly, just as light is better than darkness. The wise man has eyes in his head, while the fool walks in darkness. But I came to realize that the same fate overtakes them both. All right, the same fate. And so from the world, when we talk about this issue of worth, from a world's perspective and death, under death, this issue is fate. So when you think about fate, what comes to your mind?
Outcome.
Okay, in what way?
You're going to end at the final outcome.
There's nothing you can do about it.
Yeah, it's kind of destiny. When we think about fate, it's a predetermined outcome, right? Now imagine he's really wise and he can see that the same fate for the foolish or wise, we're going to see some other examples as we go through the book, the same fate for one versus the other. So the frustration of fate is that I have no ability to influence the outcome. That makes sense? This is that concept of the worth. His frustration is he has no ability, he has no ability to influence the outcome of of this fate. Now, he's saying, during my life and my short time on the earth, it's better to be wise than foolish. It's better to be in the light than in the darkness. So while I'm living, but that betterness doesn't really matter because in the end, this is my fate. This is what I have to look forward to. Does that make sense? Good question. So we want to. He's not. This is a good example. He's not telling us the answer, but he'll keep coming back to that, and we'll find a picture develop that he is in a way that he'll answer that. Then I thought in my heart, in verse 15, the fate of the fool will overtake me also. What then do I gain by being wise? I said in my heart, this too is meaningless, no return, no value. For the wise man, like the fool, will not be long remembered. In days to come, both will be forgotten. Like the fool, the wise man must die. So, obviously, and I think in 2 verses 3 or 4 times, this is a big issue for him, a big issue. And he's wise enough and understanding enough to, and he's watched the world and watched people to understand people die, they work hard, they're born, they work hard, then they die. And this is around and around, over and over again, this is mankind's life. This is what he sees. And with his great wisdom, it's causing him pain and suffering to see this and to realize this fate. And as he studies and examines and tests, that pleasure or wisdom or other things aren't going to influence that. Make sense? That's like kind of a big theme here. We'll come back to that. I'll try not to do that. I just want to point out that one thing is, remember when Solomon first asked for wisdom? when he first asked for wisdom, what was he asking? Why was he asking for wisdom? Wasn't for himself. But when we read about here, his question is, what did I gain from wisdom? So we see this change in him that occurred, right? It's not how did wisdom help me be a better ruler or more just leader to help. No, it's what did I gain from this? And I would say that fundamentally this is a reflection of every human being. Because at the end of the day, I'm born, I work hard, I look at my fate, which is death, and I'm not thinking about how am I helping the next generation. I'm thinking about what does that mean for me? Because that's what I have to look forward to. Does that make sense? So it's not that he's a bad guy. It's that he's representing what we all need to wrestle with. Okay, in verse 17. Next one. So I hated life, because the work that is done under the sun was grievous to me. All of it is meaningless, a chasing after the wind. I hated all the things I had toiled for under the sun, because I must leave them to the one who comes after me. So this issue of grievous, we talked about, what's his emotional state? He's grieving, he's angry, he's frustrated, he's sorrowful. I would say he's mourning. And then this issue of grievous, it's almost a sense of injustice. I have worked for all these things, and what happens to them? What's going to happen to the palaces that he built and all the wealth that he gained? And what's going to happen to that?
Go to the next generation.
Yeah, from Solomon's perspective, it seems to be an injustice or unjust that I work and gain all these things, and I don't benefit from them. Then somebody else who didn't do any work for them benefits from them. Does that make sense? And I just want us to kind of, if you would, feel the weight of what he's saying, because what he's saying is frustration is, I did all that work and I didn't get anything from it. I was the wisest person in the world. I didn't have any return from that. I had any pleasure I could have. I didn't have any return from that. In fact, not only am I not going to benefit, but someone else who didn't even do any work is going to benefit from it. He's angry about that. Okay. Let's see. I hated it. Ugh, that's a sad word. Yet he will have control over all the work in which I have poured my effort and skill under the sun. This too is meaningless. So my heart began to despair over all my toilsome labor under the sun. For a man may do his work with wisdom, knowledge, and skill, and then he must leave all he owns to someone who has not worked for it. This too is meaningless and a great misfortune. What does a man get from all the toil and anxious striving with which he labors under the sun? So, death, fate. So one of the big themes is this issue of labor. What does a man gain from all his labor, his toil, his work? Because God gave this burden. God, and it was this over and over again, God gave a burden that we have to work. And I do all this work. Why don't I gain anything from it? He's depressed. He's frustrated by this. And that's a theme in a question that he's going to ask over and over again. What does a man gain from all his toil and anxious striving for which he labors under the sun? All his days, his work is pain and grief. So I think of Solomon. He's the king and he's rich and has all this stuff. And the poor guy is out in the field, by hand digging it, trying to get something to grow so he can feed himself. And yet from Solomon's perspective, and he's also representing, we'll see, he's going to describe this as kind of the worker too. But for him, it's just pain and grief. That his experience with everything in life, the result is just pain and grief, despair, frustration. Even at night, his mind does not rest. This too is meaningless. Okay, here's another better then. A man can do nothing better in life than to eat and drink and find satisfaction in his work. This too I see is from the hand of God. So on the one hand, God gives labor, and then the best or better that can happen is, I'm just going to put enjoy. Now, what Solomon, I don't think Solomon is saying is, let me say it this way. If you had 100 laborers or 100 people working and 100 people, doing it, everyone in the room, and we're all doing our job, whatever our job is, we're doing it to the best of our knowledge, skill, and intelligence, as he described, and we're working and laboring and all that, he is not saying that God gives the gift to everyone to enjoy that. What he's saying is that it's a gift if and when we do enjoy it, that the best we can hope for as human beings, the best that we can strive, our best hope, the best a man can do, nothing better than to eat and drink and find satisfaction in his work. So here's a guy who's testing all these other things, and he's saying, I've concluded at the end of that, whatever work God gave me to do, whatever God burden he gave me to labor, the best I can hope for is to enjoy that work. Enjoy it a little bit. So if I'm a sheep herder, the best I can expect in life is that I will have some enjoyment while being a sheep herder. Maybe I can enjoy the milk or the cheese that comes from it, and that's it. That's the best I can hope for. I can eat if I have food and drink and enjoy the day, go to bed. Hey, it was a good day today. I didn't lose any sheep today. Or if I'm a doctor and I go to work hard, and at the end of the day, I go home, I can eat, drink, and I didn't have anybody die today. That's it. That's the best day I can have. He's going to say this over and over again, and we're going to find this over and over again. He's going to describe from his conclusion what is the greatest hope, and I'll just say better than enjoy our work, our labor. Does that make sense? Okay. So this too I see from the hand of God, for without him, who can eat or find enjoyment? So part of it, Solomon's recognizing when he looks at everyone, and he looks at his life, and it's all work and pain and grief, and that some people are enjoying it, what makes them different than the person who's not enjoying it? Because we're going to read, he's going to describe some workers who have no joy in their work. And his conclusion is the one who does enjoy, the only possible difference between them, the person who does not enjoy, has no joy in their eating, drinking, and work, and the person who has some joy is it must come from God, because he can't come up with, in his wisdom, any other explanation. So on the one hand, God gives labor, and then on the other hand, it seems like if someone is enjoying their work, then that must be from God as well. Does that make sense? I guess I should have said this. In my opinion, this is one of my many disclaimers in this book. I don't think, should I say this right? I think that there are many things in this book that are wrong, meaning Solomon's conclusions are wrong, not that the word itself is wrong. Does that make sense? So let me give you an example. If there's 100 people out there and 99 of them are working, they're all doing the same. They're all farmers, and they're all plowing and doing the same thing, and 99 have no enjoyment. They go to bed, they eat their potatoes. They're a potato farmer. They eat their potato, they get a drink of water, they go to bed, they're exhausted. And 1 out of 100 seems to enjoy, look how beautiful this potato is, and they seem to have some enjoyment. Does that make sense? If that comes from God exclusively or only, is God not capricious? Why did he give one person the joy and not everyone the joy? Does that make sense? And so as we read about these things, remember when I said, I don't think everything in the book is right. If that was Solomon's conclusion, I don't think that conclusion is right. But it doesn't mean that that's not Solomon's conclusion. Right? Make sense? So as we think through the book, we want to look at his conclusions, and then we want to step back and say, what led him to these conclusions? Remember, we want to remember who he is and the culture that he's in, and that he's at the end of his life, and someone's recording this, and he's the teacher. This is like the wisest person. He's teaching everybody. And at the end of this is what he's teaching them, or this is his conclusion related to who he thinks God is. And so, I think we maybe said this last week, but every human being has a theology. whether we know it or not, we have a belief in who, or a definition of who God is or isn't. An atheist has a theology. They believe there is no God. And a polytheist believes there's many gods. And so we all have a theology that influences our worldview. And Solomon has a theology about God. And as we think about it, we want to, as we go through the book, we want to kind of create this, and we want to then step back and say, what was Solomon's theology? Who did he think God was, and what did he think about God? Because that will greatly influence all these other conclusions that they are all going to come from who and what Solomon thought God was. Now, the reason I said I don't think everything in the book's right is I don't think Solomon's theology was correct. It wasn't completely accurate. Does that make sense? In what way was it not accurate? Well, we want to think about that. In what way was it accurate, if it was accurate? And how did that influence him? And this aspect of theology and worldview, I think as we look through the book, is what is so relevant for us today. Not just us, but I'll just say people in general. Okay. Chapter 3, and we're all familiar with this. There's a time for everything and a season for every activity under heaven. And we know these verses. There's a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to search and time to give up, a time of war and a time of peace. It's the same kind of a sense of around and around, right? There's a time, everything has a time, everything happens. And then, so I can recognize that there's a time and a season for everything. And what does he say in verse 9? What does the worker gain from this toil? In what way? How does a worker influence these times? How does my work or my life influence when there's a time to kill and a time to heal? How does it influence the time to weep and a time to laugh? Is it just fate and I'm just walking through my destiny? What do I gain from all my toil? I have seen the burden God has laid on men. Again, he's bringing this back. So one of the burden is labor. Here's another burden. He has made everything beautiful in its time. So we're just going to say, God made beauty in the world. A beautiful world. Okay, how is that a burden? We have some amazing sunsets around here. How is that a burden? He has made everything beautiful in his time. He has set eternity in the hearts of men. Yet, they cannot fathom what God has done from beginning to end. What is he saying there? What does he mean, eternity in the hearts of men? Because he's saying that's a burden. How is that a burden? So mankind knows they're born, they work, they die, right? Okay, well, how is beauty in the world and eternity in our hearts, how does that make that a bad thing? So theology is like the study or our philosophy about God, and then there's another one, and that is the study or our philosophy about mankind. So one of the things he's concluding is that mankind lives, you work, it's a pain, it's a labor, it's a burden, and you die. But he's also saying something I think really important here, is that human beings have the ability to appreciate the beauty that God made, and that's this aspect of eternity in our hearts. We can appreciate, I believe, unlike other animals on earth, that there is something happens after death. Like when I die, my kids are going to keep living. They're going to enjoy things. They're going to experience things. I'm going to be gone. I'm going to miss out on that. I can see a beautiful sunset and know that when I die, there's going to be another beautiful sunset. It's not going to look exactly the same. I'm going to miss that. And he says that God's put eternity in the hearts of men, but yet we can't comprehend. What does he say here? We can't comprehend. I got to find it here. We cannot comprehend. We cannot fathom what God has done from beginning to end. So on the one hand, I can understand intellectually that there was a beginning. God created everything, created the world, and that's going to go on for round and around for millennium. and I'm going to be dead, and yet God is going to, I can understand that that's all going to happen, and how frustrating it is that I can understand that, but my fate is I'm going to die. My life is just a vapor. So from his perspective, that it's a burden that God created us with this intellectual capacity, our ability to reason and think and time. We would be better off just being, he's going to talk about this, we would be better off just being stupid and not knowing and being able to comprehend beauty. We would be better off just like the animals, just go eat, find some food, die. And so it's frustrating to him. He thinks that this is a burden that God gave us these things and made us this way. And does that make sense? So we want to understand what he's saying about who God is from his perspective and what he's saying about who mankind is. So one of the things, mankind has a fate, but another thing that mankind is, we have intellectual capacity to reason and think. And we can think beyond time. We can think beyond death. And from his perspective, that's a burden. Okay.
Well, is he saying, when he says beginning to end, comparatively to eternity, he's thinking beyond the scope of time?
Yeah. And for him, that's a burden, the fact that he can do that. This death and our fate would not be a frustration. It would not be a pain. It would not be wearisome. It would not be it would not be worthless. My work would not be worthless if I didn't know that that was my outcome. Make sense? If I didn't know that I was going to die, and I just lived one day at a time and until I died, I would never be frustrated by this. I would just live and die. I'd be like, a worm, just till I die, or a sparrow. I'm eating my thing, and one day it's cold, I fall to the ground and die. So this stress and this anxiety that he's feeling is related to this. Now, when did God? So, just remember, this is his theology. And I'm going to say, I'm not sure that his theology is accurate. So he said, God gave us labor, and he's frustrated because it makes my life meaningless. When did God give us labor? He didn't create us that way, right? He did not create us that way. It was mankind. It was a result. And I like in what I have noticed in the Bible often is when God gives a punishment or he does a determination, he always includes a provision. So I'm going to propose, and as we think through this, that what Solomon sees as making life meaningless, death, and as we get through this, is actually a provision. That God had an intention in doing this, because God gave us labor. You're going to go out in the field and work in the sweat of your brow, and you're also going to die. And yet, is God an angry God? Is he what's the right word? I'm trying to think of someone who gives you something knowing that. Spiteful. Yeah, spiteful. Thank you. Is this spitefulness that God gave us, that we could see beauty in the world and that we have eternally in heart, we can think and reason? Is that spitefulness? Because his conclusion is, he doesn't have to say it, but he's saying he did this, yet this is the outcome. He thinks he doesn't understand why it's happening, and he's kind of angry with God about it. Does that make sense? Okay, so we want to just kind of tease out these points and see them and what's kind of going on. In verse 13, let's see, nothing better, no. He also said, yet they cannot fathom what God has done from beginning to end. I know that there is nothing better for men to be happy and to do good while they live. So what's better? To enjoy work, is to be happy. I know that there's nothing to be happy. And what was it? Enjoy what? Oh, and do good. This is interesting. So it's better to be wise than folly, light than darkness, to enjoy our work, to be happy, and to do good. It's better to do that while we live, while we're in the world. But at the end of the day, because this is the outcome, none of those things actually influence that. So I want us to also see the schism that exists. On the one hand, at the end of his life, he's looking at his mortality. He's thinking about everything that he did and tried to accomplish and tested, and it didn't do anything. There's no value. It didn't gain anything. And yet, at the same time, when he's reflecting back on his life, in terms of my, if you would, minute by minute living, it is better to do good than to do bad. It is better to be happy than to be sad. Now, he's going to contradict that in a little bit. But it's just a sense of his emotional and intellectual state and the frustration that he's going through. And he's wrestling. He is wrestling with these issues. And so what we see reflected in the book is the wrestling of this wise man who had no limitations of any kind in what he did and could experience in life. And so we're not gonna, but I just want us to think about, why the heck is he wrestling with this? Why is he wrestling with this? Okay, we'll keep going. We'll try to finish here real quick. I got to find where it was. I know there's nothing better for man to be happy and to do good, that everyone may eat and drink and find satisfaction in all his toil. This is the gift of God. So again, if I can eat and drink and find satisfaction in my work, then that's a gift from God. I know that everything God does will endure forever. Nothing can be added to it and nothing taken from it. God does it so that men will revere him. Verse 14. I think this is one of the key verses. I know, I have knowledge, I've experienced it, I understand, that everything God does will endure forever. Nothing can be added to it and nothing taken from it. This is one of those guess what I want questions, but what's behind that? What's behind this statement that I know that nothing that God does, nothing can be added to it and nothing taken from it?
Doesn't it kind of go with, the world goes round and round and we all die and whatever we do in the middle, it's still we all die. God made forever and everything's going to last forever, whatever God did, and we can't change it.
That's it. We can't change it. We cannot change it. This is one of the fundamental themes in the book. Behind all this is his frustration. Why it is no worth is because I have, what he has discovered is that mankind has no control or power. We have no control or power to influence this. No ability to influence it, no matter what we do. That is that's kind of like the foundational theme of this book. No ability to influence it. God has set it in motion. God does everything. Nothing crooked and twisted can be straightened. Everything goes on ground. He's in control. He's put it all in order. He's set it all there. It's kind of like a theist. The theist who we talked about believes that there's a God. He created everything and he kind of stepped back and now there it is. It just runs and runs and runs, and no matter what I do, I can't change it. I'm a squirrel on the wheel. I just run and run. The best I can hope for is that today I get a good nut. That's it. That's life.
He has a desire to change it?
Does he have a desire? Oh, absolutely. Why would I say that? Because he's frustrated because he can't. And that has to come from a desire to do that. What human being wouldn't want to influence this? In fact, I would propose that all of religion is an attempt to influence the fate of our death. I can work my way to heaven. I can make myself good with God. I can get to the next nirvana. I can be more spiritual. It's all the same thing over and over again. It's trying to do something that create some return on my investment to influence this outcome. Yeah. And so his frustration in his learning, we're seeing him learn, because to be frustrated with that, it also implies I'm starting with an assumption. I'm starting with an assumption that I should or could do something to influence that. And if I could or do something to influence that, that means I can do something to influence God. Right? Otherwise, why would I be frustrated by it? And so part of his frustration, I tested pleasure, I tested wisdom, I'm going to test other things we'll see. And I noticed that all in our labor, all we can do is work. God's put this burden and we work and work and work, but it doesn't do anything to influence the outcome. I can't get God to change. If I get to eat and drink and enjoy my work, that's a gift from God. Well, what can I do to get a different gift? What can I do to get a longer life? What can I do to change my outcome? And so that's where he's at. His frustration is coming from those sources, if you would. Does that make sense? So bingo. Yeah, that's it. That I think is like, it's one of the glaring, like, whoa, what's here? Okay, so God does it so that men will revere him. Whatever is has already been, and what will be has been before, and God will call the past to account. Now, there's a very interesting, another little thing about God is, I'll just put, God is going to judge. So there's another part of his theology is that God is going to there's going to be some kind of a judgment. He's going to call the past into account. In what way? I don't know. He hasn't said anything about that yet. But there's this sense of it. Does that make sense? So if God is there, so part of what we can see through Solomon's understanding of the God of Israel is that God of Israel is watching. Because you don't call anything to account unless you know it. So he's there kind of watching and seeing. Does that make sense? Okay, so the next verse I think is pretty amazing, verse 16. So, and God will call the past into account. And then, I saw something else under the sun. In the place of judgment, wickedness was there. In the place of justice, wickedness was there. What is he observing, or what is this statement saying? So let me say, in verse 15, God will call the past into account. And in verse 17, I thought in my heart, God will bring judgment. But in the middle of that, he is describing something. What is he seeing and describing? Okay. And what's going on in that? Right. In the place of judgment, wickedness was there. What should be there? In the place of justice, wickedness was there. Right. So, this is a really, I would say, this is one of the things Solomon, people before him, people after him, one of the things that mankind has been wrestling from as long as we probably after the fall. Is God good? And if God's good, why is there evil in the world? Why is there injustice? I saw something else under the sun. There was injustice and wickedness. Where does that come from? Who is responsible for the wickedness? If God is going to judge, call the past to the account, in verse 17, thought in my heart, God will bring to judgment both the righteous and the wicked, for there will be a time for every activity and a time for every deed. If God is there judging and he's going to judge, why is there injustice in the world? And who's responsible for it? It's a good question, right? So he's kind of testing this issue of wickedness or justice in the world. And you probably say that. There's a really cool little book if you ever want to read it. It's probably 100, it's very short. And it's called Darwin's God. Darwin, Mr., So Darwin was a theology student. And when Darwin was in school, in theology at the time, the school of thought was that God is good. And they would study the Bible for everything in it about good and how God was good and just. They didn't study I'll say the whole thing. They were selected, not just in his school, but I'll just say the culture at that time. This is kind of the Victorian era, and so God's good. And he noticed that there was evil in the world. Darwin, he wrestled with, if God is good and there's evil in the world, how can God be good and there still be evil in the world? And the theory of evolution, his theory of evolution came from him trying to explain the natural world in a way that explained evil and kept God from being responsible for it. That's where the theory of evolution actually came from. It's a fun little book to read. And so Solomon is wrestling with that same question. Is it the yin and the yang? Did God create, is his theology a God that created both good and evil? Is it good as a gift from God when I get to enjoy my labor? That's a gift. But at the same time, the person who doesn't, God's not giving them, so he's responsible for that too. Who's responsible for this injustice? Because he understands that God is going to judge. And this is kind of this, remember, culturally. Culturally, even up to the time of Jesus, but culturally, when they looked at someone who was wealthy or well off, they assumed that God blessed them because they were good. And if they were a sinner or they were diseased, that God was punishing them because they weren't, right? And it's almost the same sense here. We kind of get a sense here that God he's parsing out both good and bad. It's better to be light than darkness, but that darkness has to come from somewhere. And so one of the things he's testing and wrestling with that we don't want to miss is this issue of evil or injustice in the world. How do I make sense of that? How is he's trying to understand it. And his thought thus far is, well, at some point in the future, God's going to call it to account. But at the same time, it's not happening today, and how do I make sense of that? In verse 18, I also thought, as for men, God tests them so that they may see that they are like animals. So another thing about men, where am I putting that? I don't even know where I'm putting it. I'm just going to put animals. So when we think about mankind, from his perspective, mankind are just like animals. There's no difference. Man's fate is like that of the animals. The same fate awaits them both. As one dies, so does the other. All have the same breath. Man has no advantage over the animal. Everything is meaningless, no return, no benefit. All go to the same place. All come from dust, and to dust all return. Who knows if the spirit of man rises upward, and if the spirit of the animal goes down to the earth? So I saw that there is nothing better for a man than to enjoy his work, because that is his lot. For who can bring him to see what will happen after him? So what's he saying about mankind? What's that? We're like animals. We're just dust. Right, we're just temporal. Our life, now, does he really believe that? If we're just animals and we're just dust, and that's what he's writing, then you can see why he would say that God giving us understanding of beauty and eternity in our hearts, understanding and reasoning, and to know that there's life after death for others, how frustrating that would be, how meaningless, how pissed he would be about that. Because from his perspective, mankind, God created us, we're like a goat. We came from the earth, we're born, we eat, we die. That's it, that's our fate. And so, again, this is Solomon's writing, or the person who's writing this has seen and heard and he's the teacher. He has taught this to this person, that is the fate of mankind. I don't personally believe that. So I think another example where I don't think that's right, but it doesn't mean it wasn't truth for him. Does that make sense? He's writing what he believed or what he experienced, what his conclusions were. So again, there's nothing better for man to enjoy his work. Again, the same thing. There's this better than. One thing that's better is that we can enjoy it. That's our lot. And in chapter 4, again, I looked and saw all the oppression that was taking place under the sun. So another thing that he noticed or tested was this issue of injustice, and I'm just going to put another one, oppression. And why I like that, why I think it's important that he put oppression is, remember we talked about being just in the Bible, in the Old Testament in particular. 80% of the time that word is used, it's not referring to like a judicial court decision. It's referring to our responsibility to care for those who can't care for themselves, who can't represent themselves, who don't have any power. And so he's saying here, hey, I saw oppression. I guess I missed a P. There was oppression taking place under the sun. I saw the tears of the oppressed, and they had no comforter. Power was on the side of the oppressor, and they had no comforter. And I declared that the dead who had already died are happier than the living who are still alive. But better yet, or better than both, it is better is he who has not been born, who has not seen evil that is done under the sun. So another better than is to have not lived. It's better to have not lived than to have lived. Why is that better? Okay, they have the same fate, but he's referring to this issue. Because let me just read it again. It's better because, in verse 3, better than both is he who has not been born, who has not, i.e., because he has not seen the evil that is done under the sun. So, why would it be better to not have lived than to have seen all the wickedness and the evil? So another thing about mankind, he's saying, is that we are moral characters. We know good from evil. If I didn't know good from evil, I wouldn't be frustrated to see evil. Does that make sense? And so one of the things that God has given us is the ability to know good and evil. Oh, we know where that story came from. There's a thing called the natural law, or people call it the moral law, and it's a very fun philosophical argument for the existence of God. And that moral law, or the natural, this is called natural because it's natural for human beings to know that there are some things you don't do and there are some things you do. So the Nuremberg trial and the Nazis and all that, their argument was, all the things they did to the Jew, their argument was that they as a country decided that that was good. And they wanted to do it, and no other country had a right to tell them what to do. They didn't have a right to go in and tell another country what to do. That's what they wanted to do as a society, so it must be right. And the judges decided, they said, no, there's a higher law. And that higher law is that we all know that we shouldn't kill. We shouldn't take advantage of the lonely or the widow. Where does that come from? And it comes from that God, who put eternity in our hearts and beauty in the world, also put a moral code in our hearts. Where did that moral code come from? He doesn't say it explicitly, but the reason he's wrestling with it is that there's evil in the world. And I like to define evil this way, and this you can read about this philosophical argument, that evil in itself does not exist. So just think about that for a second. Evil does not exist. How can I say that? Because we see evil every day. Evil is the absence of good. So from a philosophical or reasoning perspective, good can exist all by itself. There can be just good. Evil can never exist by itself because it's not evil unless it's compared to good. Does that make sense? God can be good and not be responsible for evil. Evil can be the absence of what should be. And that's what he's describing here. People would be better off, have never lived, than have to see the absence of what should be. What is the absence of? The absence is the injustice. The injustice where we just read about, in the place of judgment, there's wickedness. There should have been justice, but there's injustice. And so this issue of evil is the missing in human experience, the missing of the right moralness, the right moral thing, the good. So human beings have the ability to do good and bad. And when he sees that evil is done instead of good, it's frustrating for him. And so it's so frustrating, he'd say, the person who's really happy and doesn't have to experience grief and frustration is the person who's like a dumb animal. They never lived. They couldn't think or reason. We would be better off. That's the kind of the level of his despair over this issue of seeing the existence of evil in the world and knowing that there should be good instead. And we experience that, right? We experience that as well. Okay, where was I? Okay, in verse 4. And I saw that all the labor and all the achievement spring from man's envy of his neighbor. This too is meaningless, the chasing after the wind. The fool folds his hand and ruins himself. Better one handful with tranquility than two handfuls with toil and chasing after the wind. So again, another better than It's better to have some tranquility, to work and have something than just to do nothing. Again, I saw something meaningless under the sun. There was a man all alone. He had neither son nor brother. There was no end to his toil. Yet his eyes were not content with his wealth. For whom am I toiling, he asked, and why am I depriving myself of enjoyment? This too is meaningless, a miserable business. And there's a better than. Two are better than one because they have a good return for their work. If one falls down, his friend can help him up. But pity the man who falls and has no one to help him up. Also, if two lie down together, they will keep warm. But how can one keep warm alone? Though one may be overpowered, two can defend themselves. The cord of 3 strands is not quickly broken. What's better than? Okay? We'll put that. 2 is greater than 1. So what's bad about the one? Alone. Alone is a bad thing. Why is it bad? So this is another, he's expressing something else about us humans. Why is it bad to be alone? We don't what? Right. Okay, good. You're right. Another thing about humans is that we are relational. So we're moral. He's identified that we're moral. That all these things, that we are relational. It's better. Here's this one guy, he's toiling like crazy, and he's all by himself, and he's asking the question, who am I toiling for? If I'm toiling just for me, there's no benefit in it. Now, he's already said, I can do all this toil, I can toil with a whole bunch of people, and it's not going to do anything in terms of my return on my investment. But at the same time, it's better to toil for someone than yourself. Am I making a lot of noise? Oh, am I thinking about that? Yeah. Thank you. Oh, it fell out. It's better to toil for someone else than just myself. So, for example, I'll just say, he'll talk about this as well. You'll see it. A good thing from Solomon's perspective, and I would say from our perspective, is as a parent to leave something for your children. So when I die, if I leave an inheritance for my children, that's better than not leaving anything, right? To toil so that someone else has something. It's this issue of this relational aspect. And so where did that come from? What is it, if we're just animals on the one hand, and we're just like animals, just dust, live in dust, then how do I explain, or how does Solomon explain this issue of this moral right and wrong in this relational aspect? So he sees that in humans. He sees that in people. He sees that in himself. And that it's better to be with others than to by myself. But at the same time, the fact that he can rationally understand that and comprehend it is really frustrating for him because it doesn't seem to have any meaning. There's no benefit from it. So in my day-to-day living, it's better than, but in my fate, in my outcome, and what he sees as his life moving towards, it doesn't have any influence. And so we can see this conflict that he's constantly wrestling with. Okay, we'll end here in verse 13. Better a poor than a wise youth than an old foolish king who no longer knows how to take a warning. And so it's the same thing. There is no end there is no end to all the people who were before him. He's talking about, again, it's around and around. You're born, you're the king, and then there's a successor, and they're born. It's just around and around. It's just a meaningless chasing after the wind. So it's better to be poor and wise, and this is, again, it's wisdom is better than folly. It'd be better to be poor and wise than a rich king who doesn't know anything. Okay, great, but at the end, but this too is meaningless. So every time we read, this too is meaningless, I just want to remember, he's taking us back to this equation right here. It's meaningless in what way? It's meaningless in terms of this fate that he sees mankind. And yet he's living day to day. And there are some things that are better. He's trying to test things to understand why they exist. He's witnessing lots of things about the world and around him, and from that he's drawing conclusions or a theology of who God is and who mankind is. And what are we here for? How did we get here? And God is, from his perspective, the God of Israel anyway, is ultimately responsible for what he created. But Solomon's wrestling with the issue of we were created one way and we experienced something different. And if we were created one way, and this is why did God create us for this? Why? And if there's evil in the world, why is there injustice and evil in the world if God created all these things? And I would suggest that Solomon, more than most of us, was probably more frustrated by this because he was so wise and had so much understanding. It was kind of hard for him to just blow it off, in other words. And he witnessed it and he noticed it every day, all day long. Okay, that's a lot, and we went over tonight, I apologize. But from your reading, any questions or comments that you want to add to this?
About the absence of God and all his frustration.
He definitely has an absence of a personal relationship with God. So think about this, and then think about David. In reading the Psalms and David's expression, and even when he was old, what his expression, so you're right, there's an absence of it. Where did that go? Right? Where did it go? And so we want to think about those kinds of questions like, why is there an absence? What happened? What's his theology? And what's drawing him to these conclusions? And then we want to ask, are these conclusions accurate? Is this accurate? And if it is, what does that mean? And if it isn't, what does that mean? And why does God have it in the book? Why is it in the Bible? All right, so there's a lot of unanswered questions to think about over the next week. I'll send out the next study. So there was a lot of, hopefully you had a chance to go through this. There was a lot of verses to consider, a lot of things and questions to answer. One of the questions was to chapters 3 and 4, record your thoughts of the following. So anybody have anything they want to share from those sections? I apologize for talking so much.
I would love for Paul to meet Solomon. He could have blown his mind with the gospel.
Yeah,
Might have helped.
yeah, that's right.
One thing I wrote was, where does God fit into the book?
Yeah. Why is God missing from it?
Yeah, just not seeing where he was.
Right.
I don't think that's an accident.
That's I would say when we get through towards the end, we want to come back and ask that question: where the heck is God? Where's God? We'll just say the lack of the presence or the thinking on his mind in terms of who God is and his relationship with God influences, obviously, his thinking and his decisions and his conclusions and his despair and frustration and all those things. It influences that. We are at a very different place in time and history than Solomon was. He had the Torah, basically, the first 5 books of the Bible. That's basically all he had.
I was going to ask, because we have Jesus and the Holy Spirit.
Yeah.
So was it harder prior to Jesus to have a relationship with God because he had all the laws and everything to follow?
Absolutely.
Well, he had the Psalms.
The what?
He had the Psalms. He had David's Psalms. Solomon.
Yeah, he probably did. Yep.
He had
Psalms
the Book of Job.
and Proverbs, I mean.
And, of the other wisdom prophets, Nehemiah.
None of the prophets.
He had Nehemiah.
They all came after him. Nehemiah, all came after him. Yep. Yep.
I don't think so.
Well, okay, but so Nehemiah came after the destruction of the temple. Solomon just built the temple. So this is early, right? He's the king of a nation. What do they know? They know Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They know Moses. They know that they were taken out. They have the if you were the Torah. They know all that. They have the written the book of Leviticus, for example, the sacrificial system. They have just built the temple and they have just started doing it. They have the Day of Atonement. They have all the sacrifices. And we read about him doing all those things. When the Queen of Sheba came, she got to see him do the sacrifices to God. So he has that. And he has knowledge and wisdom. Now, this is kind of just to think about. God gave him knowledge and understanding to be a good leader, right? I would propose that there's different kinds of knowledge and wisdom. God gave him worldly knowledge and wisdom to be a good leader. But that doesn't mean that God gave him spiritual knowledge and wisdom about God and heaven and earth and all that. He has to figure that out. He has to search after God. We don't get a sense that he's actually searching for God. We will get a sense that he's trying to search for meaning of his life. Does that make sense? And he's testing all those. And again, he is frustrated because they don't seem to give him any power or control to influence the outcome. And he calls that fate or destiny. And if, we have a very different experience. We have a larger story to look at and understand. But if we had no control, that would be a really frustrating situation.
Since early on, he had a relationship with God. God appeared in dreams. But later, there's no indication.
Right. His focus changed. And also remember that in the Old Testament, the Spirit of God, or the Holy Spirit, wasn't ever, the Old Testament uses the word on. It doesn't use the word in. So like with David, the Holy Spirit was on him or with him, but not like, didn't reside like he does with us. And this whole nation of millions of people, their relationship with God wasn't really like a personal relationship as much as it was a religious, cultural relationship where there was a mediator between them and God. The whole priest and the sacrifice, that was a mediator between. And the king was the person that represented that. There was a priest, but the king ultimately, if the king was good, the nation was doing well, and if the king was bad, the nation was suffering for it. And that idea of kingship or headship isn't important. We'll not run that. But there was one man, or we'll say a couple, Adam and Eve. They were the original head of the human race, and they did something that we all inherited. And there was a second Adam, another one, and his name was Jesus. And this all has to do with this representative kind of idea that God, we see throughout the Bible, that when Jesus did what he did it representing everyone else that followed him. And that's why it made it viable that what he did on the cross was for me. And so we see that here with Solomon as well. He's the king, and this is his life, and this is his conclusion, and this is what he's teaching people, right? And we shouldn't be surprised at what happens next, what happens after Solomon, because it all leads in one direction, a down and downward spiral. And we'll end with this. As we see that, we see more and more the absence of God and who God is and expected to be and who covenanted to be for them. And as the absence of God decreases, or God's influence decreases, and we see the influence of mankind and this attitude increase, then we see kind of a worsening issue related to the moral right and wrong and our relationship to one another. Okay, we'll pray and we'll quit. Lord, thank you for tonight and this confusing book. It's hard to understand, Father. It's on the one hand, it's when I read it and I think, who is this guy and what happened to him, or how could Solomon have done this? But yet in reality, Lord, I'm no different. He had the same heart that I have. I'm, as there's none that have done good. No one has sought after you, not one. And so especially this season, we thank you that you decided to do for us what we could not do for ourselves. You decided to come to earth and to give yourself to us so that we could be reconciled to you. And we thank you, Lord, that you loved us that much, even from the beginning of time, even from creation, even through Solomon's whole life. We are not a people of fate. We're a people of relationship and a God who loves us and cares for us. We ask you to bless this next week and as we study your word, that we might grow and understand you more in Christ's name. Amen.